economy rewards people who turn living communities into dead commodities. The faster this can be done, the more they profit. And that's called capitalism, right? Of course, in the long term, it's in no one's best interest to destroy natural communities. It's ultimately suicidal, right? This is our food, our air, our water. It's the source of life. And that's exactly what is so frightening about the global capitalist economy. It filters those people to the top who are willing to embody capitalism and embody that malignant perpetual growth. And as long as we are still in that economic system, no amount of rational explanation or good science is going to convince these people that what they're doing is wrong. Or suppose we do convince a group of them and they change their practices. What happens? Often it's one of two things. They either fall out of the competitive loop or they become even more popular. The obvious example here is Ray Anderson. He was the CEO of the carpet company that's featured in An Inconvenient Truth, which many of us have seen, I'm sure. He had an epiphany about the state of the planet and the impact that his industry was having, and he decided to try and green his business practices. And as a result, the business became more successful than ever. And he ended up being personally responsible for more disruption because more people were buying his products than ever before. The point is really simple. We live in an earth-destroying economy, and we are nowhere near another way of life. This is the reason that the only time we've seen significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions is during major economic recessions. And in fact, in many scientific papers, GDP is actually used as a stand-in for the levels of fossil fuel emissions. Okay, let's examine the next distinction between liberals and radicals. For liberals, actions are usually evaluated against abstract moral codes. So this is always right, and that category is always wrong. A good example that I had was in 2003 when I was protesting against the Iraq War. And after the protest, some of the people would say, the important thing is that we came out here, the war is still going on, but we made our voices heard, we shamed the people who are in power, we didn't resort to violence, and because of this, we succeeded. And I'm sitting in the back thinking to myself, am I the only one who realized that we really didn't succeed here? I mean, the war is still going on now, and I don't think the Iraqis would think that we have succeeded. So, there we were, we'd spent a lot of time and energy on this protest, and now they're saying, let's plan another one. And I don't know if some of you have heard, but when those giant protests were happening in February of 2003, George W. Bush was asked what he thought about him, and he said, this is why we're going into Iraq, is so we can bring the ability to protest to the Iraqis, so we can give them that freedom. So for me and many other radicals, the point of our activism is not to make our voices heard or to be part of the political process. The point is to win. The point is to stop those in power from destroying the planet and oppressing humans and non-humans around the world. The point is ultimately to prevent the planet from being destroyed. That's not to say that the means aren't important, because of course it's important. We have to decide how we're going to go about this. But if the destruction of the planet isn't halted, our grandchildren won't even be here in 100 years to have the discussion about this. And I think that's ultimately how we must judge our strategy on its effectiveness. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I want to take a step back now and clarify the liberal radical position. So the point here is not that liberal is bad, but rather that liberal is somewhat undeveloped. Many of the liberal positions are contained within the radical position. So as Dylan said, we're engaging in education because education is important. But then we need to take it to the next step. Education alone is not enough to create change. We need to take those educated people and engage in concrete political action to achieve our goals. So in reality, the useful aspects of the liberal positions are contained within the radical position. We need to do the personal work that's required for this movement. We need to recognize that we are powerful far beyond our ability to vote. We need to find out what it is that we love and decide what we're willing to do to protect that. And crucially, we need to find the ways that we support this toxic culture in our own hearts and minds. We need to root out those lessons that it has taught us. And alongside this work, we need to organize politically. We need to come together communally and decide how we can take effective, strategic action to defend the planet. Now, before I wrap up with liberal radical, I want to make one more point. Nowhere in the radical approach is the use of violence directly addressed. That is because radicals understand that all action must be taken in context. Our tactical decisions should not be based on abstract moral codes, but instead on effectiveness. There are plenty of times when violence has been used inappropriately, it wasn't effective, and it wasn't strategic. And there are plenty of examples of nonviolence being extremely effective and extremely strategic. But the point is this: with the dire state of the planet, we're in a life and death situation, quite literally. Each person and community needs to consider their particular situation and decide what's the most effective tactic for them to use. So a helpful example that I look to here is from the abolitionist movement, where you had people going on the Underground Railroad, and the Quakers, who are pacifists, were helping other abolitionists who carried weapons and practiced armed self-defense, but they were working together for the goal of freeing the slaves. And so they understood that pacifism is a personal moral decision, and they respected that decision. But they also realized that it shouldn't be forced on other people. And that's how I think we should treat it at this point. There's really too much at stake to be dogmatic about our beliefs in any way. Okay, so now we have an understanding of the liberal-radical distinction. Our position is, as you know, that environmentalists have, for the most part, followed the liberal model of political engagement, which is one of the main reasons for our lack of success. This is why we see a focus on technical solutions, alternative energy, biotechnology, vertical farming. What are all these things at their heart, except ways of prolonging the affluent lifestyle without challenging the fundamental power distribution that we have in the world today? 100 years ago, the biggest pollution problem in New York City was dung from horses. And so when the car was introduced, it was hailed as the solution to the environmental problems that they were facing. And now we look at New York City today. It makes me think of a woman I spoke to recently who, her child has severe developmental disabilities as a result of heavy metal poisoning from the mercury that's contained in CFL light bulbs, compact fluorescent light bulbs. One of them broke in her home, and her son now is permanently disabled because of it. So again, today's environmental solution becomes tomorrow's environmental problem. And this is a cycle we see again and again. And of course, the individualism that defines liberalism, as we saw in the graph, it helps explain why we see a focus on personal solutions: diet, hybrid cars, light bulbs, phantom power, all of this. And it's really silly to me. I always hear environmentalists talking about self-sustainability. You know, it's all about, it's almost like a contest to see who can be the most pure, who can reduce their personal impact the most. But I think it's kind of silly. I mean, I think, of course, we should all try and reduce our impact, but I mean, we're social creatures, right? We live in groups. So that's what I'm worried about, is group sustainability, is cultural sustainability. And I mean, I don't know if self-sustainability even really exists. I mean, the only time it makes sense is a ridiculous situation like Tom Hanks in Castaway or something, right? But that doesn't even make sense because he had Wilson. Okay, so back to the serious stuff. So if environmentalism takes this trajectory that we're on right now, what might things look like in the next 50 to 100 years? I had a glimpse of it when this past summer I traveled to northeastern Siberia as part of an international expedition to study climate change. And we were right up in here, near the mouth of the Kolyma River, very close to the Arctic Ocean. And from the minute I got off the plane, I knew something was wrong. And you know, it was June, it was the height of summer, but it was 95 degrees. And that heat is very unusual for that region. The Arctic is being hit by global warming more quickly and more strongly than most any other region on the planet as a result of some peculiarities in the climate system. It's already warmed significantly, 4 or 5 degrees in some areas, and it continues to do so. And the consequences of that are already visible across the landscape. So this is a temperature reading that was taken at the near the mouth of the Kolyma River where it meets the Arctic Ocean. And I don't know if you can see it, it reads 20 degrees Celsius, that's 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Later that day, I swam in the Arctic Ocean, and it felt something like a bathtub, which was frightening. So this is the landscape I saw in Siberia. This slope was literally melting before my eyes, taking down trees and plants with it. And it was a hard place to take pictures. I almost lost my boots or worse a few times. The permafrost is thawing across the landscape, faster than ever before. That frozen soil holds huge quantities of carbon that's beginning to be released to the atmosphere faster and faster. Entire forests are losing their grip on the soil and starting to keel over. They're being swallowed alive in the mud. And I can't imagine that's any more pleasant for a tree than it would be for a human. Now, for the most part, people I speak to understand that climate change is bad. But they don't fully know how bad. And I think this is a truth that we really have to face. As climate change starts to really get going, things are going to get very nasty. The oceans will continue to acidify, basically removing any chance of recovery after decades of industrial overfishing. The sea level will continue to rise, inundating coastlines around the world and causing millions of people to become refugees. That's why the small island nations are some of the most vocal advocates of reform, because they're going to be underwater. They call that climate genocide. We'll see more frequent and more powerful storms, floods, droughts, forest fires. Diseases will expand into new ranges. Water availability and crop yields will decline. And what's really scary is that this isn't the worst of it. Once the warming really starts to get going, feedbacks in the climate system start to come into effect. So the permafrost starts to thaw out. The Amazon rainforest starts to die back. And instead of sequestering carbon, they begin to release carbon. And there's huge amounts of carbon stored in these ecosystems. And so we see a possibility of tipping the entire planet into a different climate state, a Venus-like state, with carbon saturating the atmosphere and temperatures too high to support much life beyond bacteria. And the fact that scientists are even talking about this as a possibility, as a remote possibility, but as a possibility nonetheless, it should be a wake-up call that something is wrong here, and much more needs to be done than is currently being done. This is what we are facing. 2010 tied 2005 as the hottest year on record. 17 nations broke their all-time record temperatures, including Russia. It broke 100 degrees in Moscow for the first time in history, then again and again and again. Fires broke out across the country. The wheat crop was devastated. Global food prices skyrocketed. Food riots broke out in poor nations around the world where they spend a much larger percentage of their income on their food. Breathing the air in much of Russia was like smoking several packs of cigarettes a day. And I was sick when I was in Moscow because of that. The smoke from the fires colored the air much of the time we were there and stretched a distance equivalent to the entire length of the United States. Now, we are facing a truly apocalyptic scenario, and it's already begun. The crucial thing that we all must understand is that there is still time to stop this. The science is clear.